We're 15 games into the NHL season, and the Edmonton Oilers still don't know what their forward group should look like, and it's part of why they are struggling.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This is my 10th NHL season doing digital hockey content, my third as a host here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every single day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com. Download the FanDuel app, and if your first $5 bet wins, you could win up to $300 in bonus bets. On today's show, we will continue our recurring once-a-week series of analyzing who Chris Knoblauch, the Oilers coach, trusts the most in his forward group after Connor McDavid and after Leon Draisaitl. So on today's show, we are going to talk about the risers in our opening segment. In our second segment, we will talk about people who have been faded as the season has gone along. They have lost minutes. And then in our final segment, I'm going to give you my best guess as to what the Oilers lineup is going to look like once Zach Hyman returns. And that's on the horizon. So we have a whole lot to get to. Let's go to work. At the outset, it is important to address the undercurrent and the elephant in the room with a lot of these decisions. These are not solely based on performance or on contract or on perceived value or potential. When it comes to decision making, especially as far as lineup construction and player utilization, you as a coach are responsible for juggling a lot of different factors. And generally speaking, we can start to piece together what a coach cares about based on how they choose to allocate their minutes. There is no greater endorsement of a player than giving them more ice time. The more a guy plays, the more a coach trusts them. And you can be, really expensive. You can be a veteran player, but eventually there does need to be some output. There does need to be some productivity. And that's kind of your seesaw, if you will. That's what ultimately determines how far you're capable of going. And in the case of this group, and we're obviously, if you're new here, if you're not an everydayer, if you haven't been listening to this weekly series, we have been ranking what forwards after McDavid and Draisaitl Chris Knoblauch trusts the most based on a few different factors. What position they're playing, if they have wing or center versatility, if they're getting special teams time, overall ice time, and if they get to play with Connor or with Leon, both at 5-on-5 in special teams and extra situations, end of game, defensive, or end of game chasing a lead. So without further ado, unsurprisingly, in the number one spot, once again, is Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. And Nuge, by virtue of being the Oilers' most experienced penalty killer, Nuge has the most penalty kill minutes of any Oilers forward during the 2010s, and I would imagine in the 2020s so far. And he plays a ton of minutes. And when you click over to the Oilers on Hockey Reference, he's at 1904 per game for his average time on ice. He's been over 20 minutes a couple times. He's been at almost at 21 minutes on more than one occasion this year. This is somebody who has winger center versatility, who kills penalties and gets onto the first power play. This is a jack of all trades. And while I think it's fair to say the Oilers may need to start prioritizing one or the other for Nuge, and I think you're probably more likely, I should say, to get better outcomes for him if you have him in that winger role where he is in a supplementary role to Connor McDavid. And I think it's fair to point out that last year, Nuge definitely did not have his best year in terms of statistical production. The Oilers, McDavid was better away from Nuge at 5-on-5 last year than he was with him. But so far, Nuge has given the Oilers a reasonable amount of output. And we're not talking about anything crazy here, but 16 points in 15 games. And yes, I know he's got the bad goal differential, and some of that is tied to some atrocious goaltending luck, but Nuge is still the forward after McDavid and Draisaitl that Chris Knoblauch is going to use because he can be used in any situation, because he still has those, occasionally you see it. You see the glimmers of the high-end skill that made him a first overall pick all those years ago, where he is in a supplementary role where he really only has to refine and focus on certain aspects of the game, makes him invaluable to Chris Knoblauch. And sure, there's an argument dialing his minutes back might get slightly better production out of him, but this is where the Oilers are at right now. I would say if Zach Hyman were healthy, he would be next at number 2. But being that Zach Hyman is yet to play in a game this year, and we've yet to see what state he is in, we are going to put him to the side for now. Next up, Jack Roslovic, who has taken to being a Leon Draisaitl running mate like a glove. Roslovic has 8 points in 13 games. He's got 6 points in his last 6 games. His shooting percentage is a little high at 9.7, but this is somebody who has been a 20-goal scorer in the NHL, who has really high-end skating and really high-end shooting, and those traits make him dangerous. When you have him and Draisaitl creating off of the rush together, where both guys are a threat to shoot, and you have Podkolzin, who's coming up next in a second, as the forechecking pit bull to go get loose pucks, to hit guys in corners, to force turnovers. You've got a really good line composition there, and Podkolzin has continued to see his minutes incrementally creep up over the course of the year. His season low is 11 minutes, and then he's got games where he's played 18 and a half minutes, and he is trending upward. He hasn't played less than 13 minutes in a game since game number 8. He hasn't played less than 13 minutes since game number 4. So we're talking about someone who, through sheer effort and work ethic, has pushed himself up in the conversation and made himself indispensable, because he can sneak onto that power, the penalty kill, because he can play net front a little bit, and he complements what Draisaitl does so well. Podkolzin has earned himself a bigger role. And then last up is Andrew Mangiapane. And Mangiapane, I think, is an interesting case because 6 points, 15 games, perfectly adequate. Somebody who's playing 16 minutes per game, can get onto that second power play, can kill penalties, has spent time with McDavid as that line's version of what Podkolzin does for Leon. And I think Mangiapane got off to a hot start, and that has definitely buoyed him in the pecking order so far. And I think the fact that he was a free agent, I think the fact that he has an established NHL track record of being a consistent NHLer is what's kept him right here on the fringe between the two groups. Because ultimately, and we'll talk about this in our final segment more, so I don't want to step on the show, but this is who's going to get pinched by Zach Hyman coming back, and it's going to create a trickle-down effect that cascades throughout the rest of the forward group. And it might change things up a little more than you might think, but to this point, the line of McDavid, Mangiapane, and Nugent-Hopkins has produced meh 5-on-5 results. They have produced meh results. We talked about it pretty in-depth on yesterday's show. They aren't converting scoring chances at as high of a rate, though once Zach Hyman comes back, we're talking about one of the most established trios in the entire NHL when you throw Nugent-Hopkins in the mix with McDavid and Hyman. And once you start to organize how you want to sort this group out, I think that's going to help a lot of these secondary and depth players figure out how they're going to exist on this team, figure out their role a little bit better, and how they're going to execute it. But we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we will pivot our attention to players who are either stagnant in the pecking order or guys who are trending in the wrong direction, and what that means for the Oilers going forward. Let's be real. Making excuses does not solve anything. We've all heard them before. It's just stress. I'm tired. Or it happens to everyone sometimes. But when it comes to performance, sometimes your body just needs a little extra support. And that's where Rougiette comes in. Rougiette.com offers fast-acting, doctor-prescribed treatments for ED designed to help you stop making excuses and start making moves. Rougiette makes it so easy to get started. You connect with a board-certified doctor 100% online. No awkward waiting rooms, no in-person appointments. If prescribed, your treatment ships discreetly straight to your door. The process is fast, simple, and private, and it's all handled by real doctors. It's about confidence, connection, and getting back to the moments that matter. Visit rugiet.com/LockedOnNHL to get 15% off your first order. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNHL. And don't forget to use our code LockedOnNHL so they know we sent you. Rugiet, stop making excuses and start making moves. Thank you so much to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. Whether you're an everydayer, you're an infrequently, or you're brand new, want to welcome you to the show where we are trying to diagnose, we are trying to understand. And my assumption and the way I like to organize the show is I'm assuming that if you're consuming this podcast more than once a week, you're watching the games as well. Now, I understand there are some people who check in with the media that covers their teams to fill in the gaps when they can't watch. But my assumption is you are watching the games. You have an understanding that something isn't quite right yet. And I think that, especially in assembling this second segment and going through my notes here on my legal pad, this group we're going to talk about, Adam Henrique, Matthew Savoy, Trent Frederic, Ike Howard, David Tomaszek, Noah Philp. I think those guys, all to varying degrees, are kind of boxed in. And I'll start with Henrique because based on his no trade protection, his status in the league, 1,000 games, his pedigree as being a long-time successful NHL player who is adapting to what he is in his mid-30s as a player at this level where he is a step slower. He has to have a bit more of a defense-first focus, even though if you go and look at the back of his hockey card, his average season is 21 goals. The days of Adam Henrique being a 21 goal scorer are long gone, and that third line over the last 2 years under Chris Knoblauch has really taken on the responsibility of being a matchup / defense first grouping. And that's what makes it interesting that it features Adam Henrique, Matthew Savoy, and Trent Frederic. Now, Henrique is pretty locked into that third line center spot. There is a world where I could see Ryan Nugent-Hopkins maybe sliding in there and Henrique getting kicked out to the wing, but I don't think we're at that point quite yet. I think Henrique is pretty locked into his minutes based on that role and being one of their forwards that kills penalties as well. When it comes to Trent Frederic, unequivocally has been faded since the start of the season. On opening night, Trent Frederic played 16:46. His low in a game this year is 9:20. He has been consistently between 13 and 16 minutes for a lot of the season. And that sounds like a reasonable chunk, but he's getting out there for penalty kill. And the biggest indicator of a loss of faith or a lack of trust there on Knoblauch's behalf is that Frederick started the year with McDavid and Draisaitl, and now he's on a checking line whose job it is to get the puck down to the other team's end and waste time and not play a lot of defense. And Frederick is always going to be judged by his pedigree as being a former first-round pick, as being someone who there were good expectations for based on his size, his skating, his shot, his tenacity. And at a certain point, it's reasonable to say it's not going to happen. And I'm not saying Trent Frederic is a bad NHL player, but I definitely think there's an argument to be made that they did not identify the Oilers. I mean, identify his traits maybe as well as they should have in offering an 8-year contract because of the lack of offensive oomph to his game. And I know we did an episode way back in September that did really well on YouTube in terms of views and more listens than usual on audio formats, where people want this to work. We all want Trent Frederic to play well. We want him to be the player that Stan Bowman clearly thinks he can be, but the skating just is not there. And in the role he's in now, he's not going to have a lot of opportunities to put the puck in the back of the net. The responsibility of that third line with Chris Knoblauch has consistently been getting the more difficult matchups, defensive zone faceoff starts, and getting the puck in deep and working the cycle. It's the reason Jeff Skinner, even though he was a more talented player than, say, Matthias Janmark, was not getting into the lineup. And I think there's an alternate universe where Henrique, Skinner, and Connor Brown last year work out really well as a kind of feisty offensive chip-in third line that can give you, 15-ish goals per guy. But now the Oilers, as part of their overarching shift towards being a low event defense first team and trying to protect their goaltending, trying to protect their defense, they have put themselves in a position now where their bottom six effectively gives them nothing in the offensive zone. So if their top six doesn't produce, they are out of luck. And then as for Matthew Savoy, he got jumped by Jack Roslovic. And there'd be more of an argument here if Roslovic wasn't playing particularly well or the fit wasn't great. But over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, Roslovic has been one of the Oilers' best forwards. There's an argument after McDavid and Draisaitl. He has been their third best forward over the last 2 weeks. And this is somebody who has some dynamic traits in his toolbox, whereas with Savoy, it's not the most clear-cut path to getting back in the top six, getting onto the power play. He's still killing penalties some of the time, but this is a player I was very optimistic about because he was so well-rounded, because he had spent a lot of time in the AHL. And instead, he's largely been relegated to supporting cast. He's largely been relegated to being just one of the guys in the bottom six. And that's a shame to some degree because I wanted to see his offensive instincts nurtured and to see if his offensive instincts would stick at this level. And by using him in a third line role on a defense first third line, you are inherently going to stunt some of his potential growth. You are going to make him a more well-rounded player, but we know guys generally are what they are by 23, 24. And this is a player who doesn't have a ton of NHL experience and isn't being given an opportunity to develop those offensive instincts, those high-end traits that we typically see of guys selected in the top 10 of the draft. After those guys, Ike Howard, I feel bad for because he's probably not ready to be a full-time NHLer, but on a bad team, like if he was on the Sharks, if he was on the Blues, I know the Oilers lost to the Blues, but if he was on one of those teams or he was on the Blackhawks or the Canucks, where they could just throw 13, 14 minutes at him per night and just say, figure it out, get used to playing at this level, take as many shots as you want. And we're sitting here now in the first week of November, and Ike Howard's been on the fourth line. He's had a lot of games where he's played less than 10 minutes. Over the last week and a half, 10:46, 8:18, 9:17, 9:36, 9:52, 7 minutes, 8:09. They went to overtime in their last game, and he only played 8:09. That's what I mean when I say nurture and opportunities. And in terms of Howard, Tomashek as well, somebody who started out really high in the pecking order, somebody who started 15-28 second game of the season, and he's been healthy scratched 3 times already. And this is a player who signed over here as a European free agent with a reasonable expectation of being someone who could fit. And I don't think Tomashek is bad. I don't see a lot of holes in his game beyond maybe being a half step slow and getting caught leaning and reaching a little bit on defense where he's taken probably more penalties than you're okay with. And Howard, too, for that matter. I want to be fair to Chris Knoblauch. Ike Howard has taken quite a few trips, quite a few interferences that you don't need to take in trying to play better defense. And then Noah Phillip, Curtis Lazar, guys who are rotating in and out based on individual games. But all of the guys we have spent this second segment talking about are going to feel this lingering roster crunch because Zach Hyman is coming. We have heard more than one Oilers player, both forward and defenders, mentioned in trade speculation. So we are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you what the Oilers lineup should look like once Zach Hyman is fully healthy and roaring to go. The NBA is back, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game, or if you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. We're in the early stages of the NBA season. The Thunder, the betting favorite to go back-to-back at 2-1. The Nuggets checking in at 6.5-1, number 2. The Cavs, best in the East at 7-1. My Knicks, 13-1. The Lakers, with no LeBron, 13-1. And then Golden State checking in at 17-1. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Head on over to FanDuel.com, sign up, and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, to my everydayers, to my new listeners, to my casual listeners, to the people who hate watch, to the Florida Panthers fans who check in every few weeks just to complain and make fun of the Oilers. Hello, I'm glad you're watching. But when we talk about this group, I do think it is important that we address the fact that Zach Hyman hasn't played in this first month. And while Zach Hyman will always get an air of skepticism and dismissiveness from the average hockey fan who looked at that 54-goal season as a fluke, as a product of playing, he still did it. That is what has always irked me about those conversations about players being tap-in merchants or McDavid merchants, Draisaitl merchants. You still have to do it. And as evident by Trent Frederic or David Tomashek, these guys who have gotten chances to play with McDavid, play with Draisaitl, it's not the easiest thing in the world to play with a superstar and produce. And Zach Hyman has demonstrated a considerable ability to do so. So Zach Hyman's return is imminent. It could be as soon as Saturday night, maybe Monday against Columbus, maybe middle of the week next week. But once that happens, we're going to have an honest conversation about where we are going and how we're going to get there. Because if we want to play the long game, if we want to focus on trying to get ourselves as good as we can for May and June, we still need Matthew Savoy in the top 9, and Ike Howard needs to play. But if you're looking at this group and you are looking for the path of least resistance as far as roster maintenance, you're going to send Ike Howard and David Tomashek to the AHL. Both of those players are waivers exempt. They will not need to clear waivers to go down. They can play significantly more minutes. Ike Howard can play 16 or 17 minutes per game down in the AHL. And then David Tomashek can decide if he wants to stay in North America or not. And I understand the people considerations are real here. Howard leveraged his way out of Tampa Bay because he wanted to play in the NHL this year. He might be a bit sensitive about being sent down to the AHL. Ditto for David Tomashek, who led the Swedish league in points last year, probably could have stayed over there and done very well again, but wanted to cut his teeth in the best league in the world and see if he could hack it. And telling a guy, yeah, man, sorry, you got to go down to Bakersfield, that's a bit of a tough sell for guys who expected to be contributors. So with that as the preface, I am at this point. And I'm looking at my note sheet here if you're wondering what I'm skimming down at. And yeah, we got the lineup, etc. But I am envisioning we're going McDavid, Draisaitl, Henrique, Noah Philp down the middle. I think that lineup is probably the best case scenario as far as centers for right now. I think big picture wise, this group is definitely one center short. I think if they want to go where they want to, they definitely need to consider an upgrade for Adam Henrique and then kicking Henrique out to the wing or Henrique being demoted to the fourth line. Because as you've seen over the last handful of seasons, if you don't have 3 good centers on your team, you're not winning anything. And you look at those Panthers teams of the last 2 years with Anton Lundell. You talk about the Golden Knights, what they were able to get out of Brett Howden. You talk about the Lightning, what they were able to get out of Yanni Gourde. In today's day and age, you are going to need 3 centers you can count on. And I don't think Adam Henrique meets the threshold of what they're going to need from that spot. I think Noah Philp, by virtue of winning a lot of faceoffs, by having energy, by forechecking aggressively, can keep himself in the lineup. He's cheaper than Matthias Janmark is. That's another consideration if when Janmark does return, the Oilers might opt to try and keep the $600,000 in extra cap space towards the roster as opposed to trying to get Noah Philp back down through waivers. As we continue this conversation, we also have to consider the Troy Stetcher and Ty Emberson discourse that is going on, where Elliot Friedman has reported that Stetcher wants to play more and the Oilers are trying to accommodate that. But there is also the consideration that Emberson has a little bit more trade value because he's a bit younger, because he showed pretty good underlying numbers. You know, you go look at his goals above replacement for what he did last year, he was decent. And there are teams out there that would probably throw you a 4th round pick. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a team like the Oilers that is constantly reloading, constantly going after it, you are at times going to need those extra mid-round picks. And that's a part of the story. Continuing on, that leaves you with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on the left and Zach Hyman's going in on the first line. I assume if Zach Hyman is healthy, He is going back to the net front role on the power play, and he is going to be on McDavid's right at 5-on-5. That means Andrew Mangiapane is going to go somewhere else, and I think there's a strong possibility that means Andrew Mangiapane is going to the Matthew Savoy spot. Unfortunately, that likely means that Ike Howard has no chance of staying up. That almost guarantees David Tomaszek has no chance of going up. And awkwardly, that might leave Matthew Savoy himself sitting on the fourth line with Noah Philp. I don't want that. I think if the Oilers want to be one of the last four teams standing, it is going to be incumbent upon them to try and maximize the group they have. And there is a lot more potential to tap into when it comes to Savoy or to Howard by letting them play, figuring it out. And the other part of that, the flip side of that coin, if you give those guys 30, 40 games of NHL run and you still are pretty convinced they don't have it, you have data to work with then. You aren't just dooming them to AHL, NHL purgatory like so many former first-round picks who have talent but need opportunities to refine it, to develop it, figure out what they are good at, what they aren't good at the NHL level. And I get it. That's the undercurrent of a lot of this too, is I don't necessarily agree with some of the decisions Chris Knoblauch has made, but I get how he got there. I can understand the methodology, and it's pretty sound. It's pretty consistent with what he has done at large. But that means if we're bumping Mangiapane down, that leaves our third line likely as Mangiapane, Henrique, Frederick. That's not bad, but it's probably not chipping up in as much offense as you want. And that means Savoy is going down to the fourth line because just based on optics, you're not doing that to Trent Frederic, who's on an 8-year deal who is under contract through the end of the decade into the mid 2030s, which is a preposterous sentence. Ike Howard's not a fourth liner. David Tomaszek is not a fourth liner. The Oilers have a very awkward roster construction where they have a ton of bottom six forwards who can play center, who can play wing, and it still feels like they don't have enough pieces. And some of that is the type of talent they need. They don't have enough shooters. They don't have enough finishers. I would dare say they probably don't even have enough playmakers. But because they have a lot of talented guys, because they have the high-end forwards they do, they can make some of their problems go away. The power play being one of the best in the league this early has buoyed some of the concerns when it comes to the depth scoring. And right now, once you get past McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent-Hopkins, and the last 2 weeks of Jack Roslovic, offense has been kind of hard to come by. And right now, the Oilers are not in a position where they can afford to go out and improve the lineup yet. There just simply isn't a market developing because so many teams are in the mix. They're going to have to wait a while to get another top 9 forward in here. They probably need to add a goalie who is capable of starting close to half of the games in here. And I dare say they could even stand to add another defenseman to this group, even with the return of Alec Regula. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. For your second listen, be sure to check out Locked On NHL Game Night, where the guys are breaking down every game, every night until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned in June. I will see you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Until then, let's go Oilers.